Good morning. I actually just want to honour David because, David, you're 87 today. It's my 11th spiritual birthday this week, so I share a birthday with you, but I just honour you because you stayed the course. I grew up in church, I left, rejected Jesus and came back 11 years ago. So, yeah, I just want to honour that. Those people who say they haven't got much of a testimony because they've stayed in church all their lives, they're amazing. So thank you, David. Anyone seen the musical Joseph and his Technicolor Dreamcoat? Yes. I was trying to work out when I first saw it. I was 12, and the West Kent Youth Theatre came to our school, and they played it, and it was amazing, and I absolutely fell in love with this story. But what we're talking about is nothing like that. Okay, so Pharaoh is not Elvis. Just want to put it out there so we know. But we are carrying on with this series on Joseph, and for those who might not have been here for the whole time, just a quick recap. So Joseph was a bit of an obnoxious teenager, no filter whatsoever, and he really wound his brothers up, and so they sold him into slavery. And then he went over to Egypt. I was looking that up. That's about 250 to 300 miles, depending upon where he was. So it's a long, long way from home. And he's gone to Egypt, and then he finds a bit of favor. God is with him the whole time, and he's in Potiphar's house, and we know what happened there, that he eventually he got thrown into prison, and we find him now kind of languishing in prison. And if you don't know, and we have the benefit of hindsight of reading the Bible or having watched the musical, that God is with him and he's going to come out of the end of this. But it's 13 years from when he first is sold into slavery to when he gets his freedom. 13 long years. He had a lot of ups and downs in his life, probably more downs than ups. But last week, Mark was talking about the cupbearer and the baker, and they had these dreams in prison, and Joseph had this opportunity to explain what the dreams meant. And this is a moment of up for Joseph, because when he speaks to the cupbearer, he says, "But when all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison." You can almost imagine the hope that rose up within him. Yes, I've interpreted this dream. This cupbearer is going to go out. And I imagine every time the prison doors open for the next few days or even weeks, he would have thought, that's it. They are coming to get me. But we're going to be looking at chapter 41. And if you want to look in Genesis 41, have your Bibles open, we're going to dip in and out of it. But it starts with what I think are pretty tragic words. When 2 full years had passed. 2 full years from that point of interpreting the dream, and he's still in prison. And if you think back 2 years, you've had 2 birthdays, you've had 2 Christmas celebrations, and you've probably done a lot of things in between. And all that time, Joseph is still in this prison, and you can imagine how he's feeling. But Pharaoh has this dream, and we read that he had a dream, and he's desperate for it to be interpreted. So he's calling upon all the wise men in his country, and no one can interpret this dream. And I imagine the cupbearer was round and about and hearing these things, and then all of a sudden he must have gone, oh, whoops. There's this guy in prison, and I was supposed to say something. But I want to ask the question, what if he had said something 2 years previously? What if he had gone to Pharaoh at that point? Do you think Pharaoh would have let him out at that point? Because Pharaoh didn't have the need for a dream interpreter, not that we know of. Timing is always in God's hands, and the timing 2 years before wasn't right. But now, the timing is right. Pharaoh needs a dream interpreter. And so when the cupbearer tells him, it seems like a good idea to get this guy out of prison and to ask him what the dream meant. And in verse 14, it says, Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was quickly brought from the dungeon. When he had shaved and changed his clothes, he came before Pharaoh. And I often think when you read the Bible, when something really obvious is stated, you need to actually stop and think, why is that in there? Because Joseph had been in prison. I doubt it had lovely shower facilities and new clothes and wardrobes to choose from. Of course, he was probably going to be pretty smelly. He was probably going to have like long hair, horrible straggly beard. So the Bible's telling us something that's actually quite obvious. He shaved and changed his clothes. But I believe it's telling us something more, because culturally, the Egyptians were clean-shaven. They didn't have beards, and they would have associated beards with being foreigners or shepherds who they really, really didn't like, or prisoners. So he shaved his beard. And the significance of that, I think, is that he was stepping out of the identity of being a prisoner and stepping into the identity of somebody who could walk into a royal court with his head held high. He was stepping out of an old identity. And also he changed his clothes, and we know from the Bible that quite often when we change our clothes, it's significant. So if you think of the prodigal son, when he came home, he was given a new robe, he was given sandals, he was given a ring, and that really marked his restoration back into the family. Zechariah 3, it talks about the high priest having filthy garments, and they're replaced with clean robes, and that signals forgiveness and readiness. And again, we know in Isaiah 61, it's one of my favorite passages, and it talks about a lot of divine exchange. He gives beauty for ashes, he gives the joy for mourning. And I believe that this is where Joseph is showing that he's going from a place of shame to a place of honor, from his captivity to start to step out into his calling, the calling that God had on his life. And he's been there 13 years from this point back to when he started, 13 years, and it's produced in him humility. We know that he wasn't very humble when he was talking to his brothers. We know that God's had to work on that part of his character, but I also believe it's brought wisdom. And I think this outward change of shaving and putting on new clothes actually mirrors the inward transformation that God had done inside him. He now seemed to be more humble, more grounded, definitely more wise. He was making wise decisions. And I believe that when God opens the door to us, how we step into that really matters. What posture, what identity are we carrying? And the challenge really is are we positive about our identity as holy ones? If you do the Freedom in Christ course, it talks about being holy ones, saints who sometimes sin. Or do we carry that posture of, oh, woe is me, I'm a sinner, I'm unclean? Sometimes as Christians, we still act as if we're in the prison, when really we need to step into the fullness of what God has given to us. So now Joseph's standing before Pharaoh, and Pharaoh says to him in verse 15, I had a dream, and no one can interpret it. But I've heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. I cannot do it, Joseph replied to Pharaoh, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. And there we see that posture of humility. No longer the puffed up Joseph, but I can't do it, but my God can do it for you. So Pharaoh explains the dream. And for those who've seen the musical, you'll remember the fat cows and the thin cows and the sheaves of corn. Basically, the 7 fat cows are eaten by the 7 thin cows. And this is symbolic of there's going to be 7 years of plenty. It's going to be a great harvest. We're going to be so well off. But then after that, 7 years will come of hardship, of famine, and that will eat up the good of the 7 years. It's all going to be a disaster. But also Joseph then goes on to say, well, I have a solution for you. You need to find a very wise and discerning person to manage this. So he's putting that thought forward. Verse 37 says, the plan seemed good to Pharaoh and all his officials. So Pharaoh asked them, can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God? Pharaoh is recognizing there's something in Joseph. As Potiphar had recognized earlier, when we read earlier, he had recognized, and there was favor upon Joseph. And Pharaoh decides to appoint Joseph not because he sees a Hebrew prisoner, but he sees a man filled with the Spirit of God. The identity we carry matters. So Joseph had responded to 13 years of hard work. You know, he could have stayed the same. He could have gone bitter. He could have been cynical. But he responded to God and allowed God to do the work that he was doing within him. But I wonder whether there's people here today who relate to Joseph's journey. We have frustration when we're overlooked. Frustration when the dreams that we've had don't seem to come to fruition. We had this huge dream that we would go this way, and actually we've gone totally in a different direction. Life's happened and caused us, to lose those dreams sometimes, to not be able to walk into them. We also struggle, I think, sometimes with unanswered prayers. We have those moments where we're crying out to God. How many times did Joseph cry out to God in that prison? We don't know, but I imagine it was pretty much every day, maybe every hour of every day. And sometimes we have unanswered prayers, and that can be frustrating, and that can cause us to go into a bitter place or into a bad place as Christians. But also, Joseph suffered with the pain of being let down by people. His own family let him down, sold him into slavery. His own family. And then his employers, Potiphar and Potiphar's wife. Potiphar probably just acted, didn't really find out what had actually happened, and threw him into prison. And now we've got the cupbearer who's forgotten him. Promised to go and tell Pharaoh about him and forgot him. So he's been let down. And I wonder whether we can relate to that. We've been let down by people. And then finally, timing. And I don't know about you, but as a Christian, it's so frustrating, isn't it? Because God's timing is never my timing. And it always seems a lot slower than my timing. So we can be frustrated by events. We can be frustrated by people. And we can be frustrated by timing. And how we choose to respond to that is so important. In lockdown, I decided that I was so bored, I would become a gardener. So I ordered lots of seed trays, lots of compost, lots of seeds, far too many. The greenhouse was full and beyond. But there I was, and I planted loads of seeds. And then every day, impatient Sarah went out to have a look to see whether there was any growth. And it took forever. And I kept going, and then one day I saw this little green shoot coming up, and then more and more. And I think the gardeners are all nodding. It did build patience in me. But it's that darkness and the pressure and the silence, those seeds are growing. But what's actually happening is those little roots are going down and those little shoots are going up. And I believe that was what was happening with Joseph in that prison. He was in darkness. He was in silence. He probably wasn't hearing from God that much. But these roots were growing. His character was forming. The shoots were growing up, ready for that moment when he would come out into the light. And when that little green shoot comes out, then it can become fruitful. Joseph's prison was where he was going to grow, but also he was going to fulfill the promises to Abraham. Abraham was his great-grandfather. And we know that Abraham had a great promise. It's a promise that God would make him a great nation, bless him, and make his name great, and through his offspring bless all families on earth. And this is what he's done with Joseph. Because if the famine had come, there is a danger that Joseph's family would have been wiped out by the famine. This is part of God's fulfillment of his promise. He's a covenant God. And when he's made a promise to you, he keeps it. It's a covenant. So what was God doing in Joseph during this time? I think there was two things. Firstly, character. He was looking at his character. And we know he had no filter. He was proud. He had these dreams. Even in Potiphar's house, he was heard to say, "No one is greater in this house than me." So that still hadn't been kind of wiped off him at that point. But by Genesis 40, when he's talking to the cupbearer about his dream, we start to see a shift. He says, "I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews." What he doesn't say is, "My brothers sold me into slavery." It seems like the bitterness or the unforgiveness is going, and he's kind of just telling a story as it is. And God is working on his character. But also there's practical skills. Because when he comes out of this and he's going to be heading up Egypt's food plan, he needed some skills. And so God had put him in positions where he would learn a number of skills. Running Potiphar's house, it would have been a huge household, and he would have learned organization skills. He'd have learned delegation, leadership, purchasing, all the sort of skills that were going to be helpful for him as he stepped out into this role in Egypt. But also, he'd come from Canaan. He was in Egypt. He needed to learn a new language. He needed to learn a new culture. And if his language skills were anything like mine, 13 years was probably just about enough to get fluent. But it's not easy. He had to learn to immerse himself into a new and different culture. I think if he'd been launched into ministry earlier, it wouldn't have been the same response. He could have failed. He could have lacked the skills or the maturity or the cultural understanding to do the job that God had for him. But how often do we want to throw ourselves out into the limelight or into what we think our calling is when God hasn't yet done the work, or we haven't allowed God to do the work that's needed? And I'm just reminded of, I was talking to Carla the other day, and she was telling me about their tortoises. Now, this sounded very cruel to me to start with, but don't judge her. They put the tortoises in the fridge to hibernate. And I'm reassured it's not the fridge they normally use, it is a different one. But one of them made an escape bid, and one of them tried to get out. So they found this tortoise on the floor, kind of, I think she said it was on its back actually. Without opening its eyes, kind of sniffed around, realized it had come out too soon, and then hibernated back in the garden. How much are we like that, trying to throw ourselves out into the limelight? Throw ourselves out because we see the calling as being greater than the journey to get there. And I did this myself, I've got to be honest. Just after I became a Christian, I wrote a book, and I sent it to a number of publishers, and one came back, and I was so excited. They said, "We love your book, but you haven't been a Christian long enough, so we won't publish it." Absolutely right response, but at the time I was so angry. I was so mad. But looking back, I wasn't mature enough. I couldn't have answered questions that people had come to me in a gracious way. My character wasn't yet formed. It was exactly the right answer. Sometimes we want to do things, and God's saying, hang on, take your time. And I think now, as Joseph finally stands before Pharaoh, it's obvious that he's not just someone who can interpret dreams. His character has started to show. He's wise. He's discerning. Pharaoh doesn't just see his gifting. He sees the wisdom. But the defining feature that Pharaoh sees is this man carries the Spirit of God. And I think we can ask ourselves, would I be seen in that way? If I'm going through a season where everything's not going my way, or my promise hasn't yet come, will people still look at the way we respond to things and go, that person carries the Spirit of God? Or are they going to see someone who's angry or struggling in that season? Not all of us are walking in our calling right now. So ask yourself, what do people experience when they're around you? Because even on this journey, we are called to carry influence. We don't just get influence when we get to the end goal, when we get into our ministry, when we get into whatever God's called us to do. We can influence those people around us, like Joseph did in that prison. The baker and the cupbearer knew enough to ask him to interpret the dream. He saw favor. The gods gave him a good job. He was carrying influence. I think Joseph came to understand something vital, which was that the journey he was on was formative and as important as the destination. He yielded to the journey because it was important. Fruitful Christians don't emerge from a place of comfort. Okay, if you're going to be fruitful as a Christian, it ain't going to be comfortable. It's going to be difficult. But in that process, in that pruning, in that pressure, we grow. But I just want to say today, when you're in the shadows, God hasn't forgotten you. Okay, it's easy to think, God's forgotten me, where are you? No, he's not forgotten you, but he might be doing something in you that's important. And let's ask ourselves, what is he doing in us? He might be exposing false beliefs. You might be carrying stuff, things that have been spoken over you all your life. You're not good enough. You're not worthy. God wants us to work through those things and come out knowing him better, our identity fully in him. He might be loosening our grip on approval. Some people want to come out the shadows because they want what they think will be the applause. And God might be training us. It's an audience of one. It's not what other people think. So maybe he's working on that part of our characters. And Joseph isn't alone. He stepped into his calling at 30. King David also stepped into his calling later in life. He was the shepherd king. He was anointed when he was a young boy, but he didn't step into it until he was 30. Jesus didn't step into his calling until he was 30. Now listen, the number 30 is not important because a lot of us would be well past it if we wait for 30. But it just shows that sometimes God isn't going to throw you into something until you're ready. It's about that maturing. It's about getting into that right place. God's timing is always perfect. And if you can't step into what you sense God has got for you, or a promise or a word that you have, somebody's prophesied over you, you've got something that you know God's going to do, and you can't step into it yet, why don't you ask yourself, rather than why isn't this happening yet? Holy Spirit, what are you doing in me right now? What are you forming in me right now? So when Joseph shaved and changed his clothes, I think he changed how he presented himself so he could serve God in a new space, to present himself so that he could be that ambassador for God. He had to learn a new language. He learned how to communicate. And maybe what God's doing us is teaching us. Do we need to lay down some old things, some old ways of talking, gossip, the way we speak, the way we talk? Is he trying to help us to get into a better place of communication where we can actually share the gospel well, where we kind of get out of that Christianese thing where we talk all this language that people don't understand? Is he honing something in you so that when you get to your calling, you'll be better served to communicate the love of Jesus to other people? Or is he training you in how to carry yourself? Joseph didn't walk into the prison with his head down and that posture of, woe is me, or I'm not worthy to be in your court. He walked in there shaved, new clothes, and I think he had his head up, and I am worthy to be in this place. And maybe God's teaching you that you're a child of God, and you're worthy to be wherever he's called you to be. And for some of us, especially in family spaces, I think that posture actually means that we let transformation speak louder than our arguments and our words. We walk with that posture of, I am a child of God. We don't need to persuade people with argument. And then how we handle responsibility. Joseph stepped up. It says in Potiphar's house, he had favor and he had a good job. And in the prison, he stepped up and he was given responsibility. Paul writes to the church at Colossae in Colossians 3, and he says, whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord, not for human masters. Work at it with all your heart as if working for the Lord. Sometimes we might be where we don't want to be, but we still need to work as if working for the Lord, and that means with all our hearts. And finally, how we step into our calling. We need to leave old stuff behind. The old clothes need to be left behind. The labels that you might be wearing need to be left behind. The shame, the bitterness, the pride, they need to be shed and left behind. And if you're carrying something today, a label or something that's not of God, leave it behind and step out in freedom. We need to be ready when the door opens. Okay, God might be doing that work in you. The door might not have opened yet, and it might not open for years, or it might be opening next week. I don't know. But we need to be ready. So we need to keep doing the unseen work. And sometimes that's the hardest bit, isn't it? The unseen work, because we want people to see us. We want the approval of man. But God sees. He sees what you do in the secret place. He sees your heart and how you're serving. So we need to keep bending and keep allowing God to shape our character. I've written down here, don't focus on the gifting. Sometimes we focus on what we think we're good at, what we think God's given us. Actually focus on the journey and allow God to lead you into your gifting, whatever that might be. Joseph shaved and changed his clothes, and then when it mattered most, he said, I cannot do it, but God will. We can't do it in our own strength, but God will help us. Many Christians are not walking in freedom because they want the promise without the process. Okay, many Christians are walking outside of God's will for their lives because they're looking in the wrong direction. They're not looking towards God. But I believe that Joseph shows us that how we respond to what God is doing in us will make all the difference. So choose to surrender to the process and trust his timing, regardless of where you are on the journey. His timing is always perfect. Frustrating, but always perfect. So when Joseph stood before Pharaoh, he didn't just bring a skill, he carried the Spirit of God. And that's what's attractive. When I first walked into a church about 11 and a half years ago, what attracted me was the people who carried the Spirit of God. That's what attracted me, and that's what I wanted. I wanted to be like them. I wanted to have the peace that they carried. I wanted to have the joy that they carried. Even in horrendous circumstances sometimes, they still carried the Spirit of God, and that is what attracted me. When we allow God to shape us in the shadows, what emerges isn't just gifting, it's that presence. And we can take that into our families, we can take it into our workplaces, take it into our communities, wherever we are. Be a carrier of the presence of God. A life marked by the Spirit of God has favor on it. People will notice. People will ask you eventually what's different once they get to know you. And that's the freedom. So it's not about escaping the process. It's about being formed by it, so that wherever we are in our lives, we carry the Spirit of God and we carry him well. So my encouragement as I just come in to the end here is, how are we carrying our faith? What do people see when they see you? Are you bitter, angry, annoyed at what isn't happening in your life, what God's not doing? Or are you somebody who is walking, even though you might just still be on the journey and not your destination? Can people look at you and say, that person carries the Spirit of God?